There is something inside you that you were never meant to discover. A truth buried so deeply within your unconscious that the world hoped you would ignore it, fear it, or mistake it for weakness. Yet here you stand, feeling the quiet pulse of it, a calling, a pull, a whisper from the part of you that has been waiting your entire life to be seen. This knowledge is not comfortable. It is not soft or polite. It is the kind of truth that rearranges a person from the inside out. The kind of truth that, if misunderstood, could become destructive. And that is why, for generations, people were taught to look away from it, to deny it, to pretend it wasn't there. But today, you are not here to turn away. You are here to awaken. There is a part of you that has been waiting in silence, waiting behind the noise of your daily life, waiting behind the expectation of the world, waiting behind every mask you learned to wear long before you even understood why you needed those masks. This part of you is not foreign. It is not some mystical stranger lurking in the shadows. It is you, the deeper you, the unfiltered you, the one that existed before the world told you who you were allowed to become. And yet, this is the part of yourself you were never taught to explore. Instead, you were encouraged to fear it, to bury it, to pretend it was too dangerous, too unpredictable, too inconvenient. Because if you ever truly met this version of yourself, you would no longer be governable by the stories the world has handed you. You see, there is a very old truth hidden in the human psyche. The moment a person realizes who they truly are, a kind of inner liberation takes place, a quiet revolution that begins on the inside long before it manifests on the outside. And revolutions, even the gentle ones, threaten the systems built on complacency. So you were conditioned to believe that exploring your inner world was self-indulgent, irresponsible, or even frightening. You were taught to look outward for validation, for power, for meaning, for identity, because the world benefits when your gaze is fixed anywhere except within. But the truth is that everything you have been searching for outside has been quietly watching you from the inside, wondering when you would finally stop long enough to see it. This hidden self does not shout. It does not force its way into your awareness. It speaks in impressions, in intuition, in the moments when you feel strangely out of place in your own life, as though you are meant for something more, but cannot articulate why. It reveals itself in the times you suddenly notice the emptiness behind achievements, in the unrest beneath routines, in the quiet ache that tells you that somewhere along the way you abandoned something essential. This is the voice of the self you were never supposed to meet, not because it is dangerous, but because once you encounter it, you will never again be comfortable living a life that is smaller than the truth of who you are. Every human journey begins with the pursuit of belonging. But at some point, if you are brave enough, the journey shifts. You begin to realize that belonging at the cost of yourself is not belonging at all, it is exile. The hidden self begins to stir when you finally grow exhausted from carrying identities that were never yours, dreams that were inherited, roles that were expected, and behaviors that were rewarded only because they kept you predictable. When that exhaustion appears, most people run from it. They drown in distraction. They mistake it for failure or weakness. But it is neither. It is an invitation. What you feel in those moments is the beginning of your true awakening. It is the whisper of the self saying, I am still here. And once you hear it, even once, you cannot unhear it. You begin to sense how much of your life has been lived in reaction to the world instead of in alignment with your inner truth. You begin to see how much of your strength has been spent maintaining illusions instead of expanding your actual potential. You begin to realize that the person you were told to become is too small for the person you are capable of being. This hidden truth about yourself is powerful, not because it grants you dominance over others, but because it grants you sovereignty over your own life. It frees you from the invisible scripts you've been following without question. It reveals that the greatest limitations you face are not the walls around you, but the walls within you, walls constructed from fear, from conditioning, from a lifetime of trying to fit into shapes that were never designed for your spirit. And once those walls begin to crack, Once light begins to seep through, you understand why this part of you was kept hidden for so long. It changes everything. It challenges everything. It frees everything. And yet, this awakening requires courage, not the loud kind that the world praises, but the quiet courage of facing yourself without excuses, without disguises, without running. It asks you to step into a truth that is both empowering and demanding. For once you know who you truly are, you can no longer pretend you are powerless. You can no longer shrink to make others comfortable. You can no longer betray your own soul without feeling it tear. This is the knowledge you were never meant to discover, the truth that you are far more capable, far more resilient, far more extraordinary than the world ever taught you to believe. And now that you've glimpsed it, the real question is no longer, who am I supposed to be? But rather, who am I finally ready to become? There is a moment in every person's inner journey when they finally stop running from the parts of themselves they do not understand. These parts are not the polished qualities you proudly present to the world, not the trait you are praised for, not the strengths that make you feel competent and admired. No, what waits in the depths is something far more unsettling, far more honest, and far more transformative. It is the shadow, the hidden side of your psyche that carries everything you avoid, your fears, your impulses, your unmet needs, your suppressed desires, your unspoken anger, your long-forgotten wounds. And for most of your life, you were taught to push it away, to pretend it wasn't there, to keep it buried, because you believed that facing it would make you dangerous. But the truth is the opposite. Avoiding it is what makes you vulnerable. There is nothing more hazardous than a person who is unaware of their own depths. When you do not know your shadow, it controls you quietly, indirectly, seeping into your reactions, your choices, your relationships, your habits, often without your awareness. It shows up in the moments you say something you didn't mean but felt anyway, in the times you sabotage your own opportunities, in the ways you cling to people who hurt you, or push away people who love you. It shows up when you explode over something small, not because of the moment itself, but because it triggered something old and buried. It shows up when you repeat the same patterns, despite promising yourself you would never go down that path again. The shadow becomes a puppeteer when the conscious mind refuses to acknowledge its presence. And this is where the true power of awareness begins. For when you dare to turn inward and face what you have long avoided, you begin to reclaim the energy you once used to hide from yourself. You begin to understand that the shadow is not your enemy. It is simply the part of you that has never been heard. It is the younger version of you trapped in unprocessed memory. It is the part that learned to survive long before you learned to reflect. It is the part that still operates from instinct, from fear, from old stories that never got the chance to be rewritten. When you turn toward it with honesty instead of judgment, when you listen instead of suppress, something extraordinary happens. The shadow stops being a hidden force and becomes a source of strength. You start to see that your fears point directly toward the areas where you are meant to grow. Your anger reveals where your boundaries were never honored. Your insecurities show where you abandoned yourself. Your impulses highlight where your needs have been ignored. What once felt like chaos begins to make sense. What once felt overwhelming becomes information. And what once felt shameful becomes an opportunity for transformation. This is why knowing your darkness is the first step to mastering your light. You cannot choose differently until you understand what is choosing for you. People often think that strength is found in suppressing the dark parts of themselves, but real strength is found in integrating them. The moment you allow your shadow to speak, you begin to understand your motives with clarity. You stop mistaking emotional reactivity for intuition. You stop confusing avoidance with peace. You stop thinking that pretending everything is fine will somehow make it so. Awareness brings responsibility. Responsibility brings intention. And intention brings power. This is why the second you become aware of your shadow, the balance of your inner world shifts. The parts of you that once competed begin to cooperate. The energy you wasted hiding pieces of yourself becomes available for creation, purpose, and direction. Your relationships change, not because others change, but because you finally see them without projecting your hidden wounds. Your decisions change not because your life becomes easier, but because you are no longer making choices from fear. You begin to act instead of react. You begin to choose instead of chase. You begin to respond instead of collapse. And perhaps the most remarkable transformation is this: the moment you integrate your shadow, compassion arises naturally for yourself and for others. You start to realize that everyone carries their own unspoken battles. Everyone hides their own fears. Everyone has a part of themselves they wish they could bury. This understanding does not make you weaker. It makes you wise. It gives you the calmness of someone who no longer fears their own depths. It gives you the stability of someone who knows what lives inside them and chooses to face it rather than flee. Facing your inner darkness does not eliminate it, but it removes its power to control you. And once you understand this, once you feel the weight of your shadow transform into the foundation of your strength, you realize why this knowledge has been avoided for so long. Because the person who knows their own darkness cannot be manipulated by the darkness of others. There comes a moment when a person stumbles upon a truth so quietly powerful, so subtly transformative, that nothing in their life can remain the same afterward. It's the moment you realize that the strength you've been searching for, the confidence you've been trying to build, the courage you've been waiting to feel, none of it comes from the outside. It has always been inside you, sealed behind layers of conditioning, fear, and expectation. And this inner strength, this forbidden power, is something the world never intended for you to uncover. Not because it is evil, but because once you discover it, you cannot be controlled, diminished, or underestimated again. Society has always had an interest in keeping people small. A small person is predictable. A small person is compliant. A small person questions themselves more than they question the world around them. But the moment you come face to face with the truth of your own power, not the superficial image you show others, not the borrowed confidence built on approval, but the deep, undeniable force that lives in your core, the script begins to change. The balance begins to shift. And suddenly, you realize that the limitations that once guided your life were never yours to begin with. They were handed to you by people who feared what you might become if you ever truly awakened. There is a quiet rebellion in recognizing your own worth. Not the kind of worth that comes from achievements, titles, or validation, but the kind that rises from knowing you are capable of shaping your own path. This recognition destabilizes the lies you've been conditioned to believe: that you are not enough, that you must earn love, that you should seek permission, that you should shrink to keep the peace, that you should wait for the right moment to claim your potential. These lies served a purpose. They kept you manageable. But once you see through them, they dissolve like smoke. The world becomes uncomfortable with individuals who know their power, not because such individuals are a threat to others, but because they disrupt systems built on self-doubt. When you awaken to your inner strength, you stop apologizing for your existence. You stop diluting your ideas to make others comfortable. You stop carrying the emotional weight that doesn't belong to you. You stop being impressed by illusions of authority, because you begin to understand that every human being, no matter how confident they appear, is wrestling with their own hidden uncertainties. This is why this strength was never talked about openly. This is why you were encouraged to fit in rather than stand out, to follow, rather than lead yourself, to accept a script rather than write your own. Because a person who becomes aware of their inner power becomes unpredictable. In the best possible way, they start choosing themselves. They start listening to the deep signals of their intuition. They begin to respect their own boundaries. They begin to place value on their time, their attention, their energy. They start to walk with an unshakable calm, not because life becomes easy, but because they have stopped abandoning themselves. Once this power awakens, it doesn't roar. It hums. It gives you the clarity to walk away from what drains you. It gives you the strength to say no without guilt. It gives you the courage to start again without shame. It gives you the maturity to let go of what was never meant to stay. And it gives you the resilience to continue forward even when the world doubts you. This inner power is not the kind that seeks domination. It is not the kind that manipulates or harms. It is the kind that makes you deeply rooted in yourself, so deeply rooted that no storm, no rejection, no betrayal, no failure can uproot you. It is the kind of strength that demands responsibility rather than ego. Because when you truly understand your inner power, you also understand the weight of using it with integrity. You see clearly that your strength was never meant to be a weapon against others, but a foundation for your own becoming. Once a person tastes this truth, their life begins to align in ways that once seemed impossible. Opportunities that once felt out of reach suddenly come within grasp. Relationships that once drained you lose their hold. Dreams that felt unrealistic begin to whisper again, asking to be followed. And the person you used to be, the one who doubted, hesitated, apologized, and diminished themselves, begins to fade like an old shadow outgrown by the light of your becoming. And this is why this truth was hidden, because the moment you discover your inner power, you realize you were never meant to live a small life. There is a moment after you uncover your inner strength when you begin to understand that power itself is neutral. It has no moral direction. It becomes what you make of it, what you feed into it, what you allow it to express. And this is where many people falter, not in discovering their power, but in learning how to hold it without letting it consume them. Because the truth is, having power does not make you wise. Responsibility does. Awareness does. Consciousness does. Power without responsibility is merely impulse dressed as authority. But power held with self-understanding becomes something entirely different. It becomes creation rather than destruction. Most people spend their lives believing that the greatest danger lies in the weaknesses they hide. But the real danger lies in unused strength, untamed strength, unexamined strength. When a person awakens to their inner power without knowing themselves, without facing their shadow, without understanding the origins of their choices, their strength becomes reactive rather than intentional. They defend when they should reflect. They attack when they should listen. They dominate when they should understand. They respond from old wounds rather than present wisdom. It is not power that corrupts. It is unconsciousness within a powerful person that becomes destructive. The more you learn about yourself, the more you understand that strength is not something to display, but something to carry with humility. You start to see that the greatest victories are often silent. The greatest boundaries are invisible. The greatest transformations happen internally long before they manifest externally. You begin to realize that true power doesn't demand to be seen because it is rooted so deeply in your being that it does not require validation or performance. Power that needs recognition is insecurity wearing armor. Real power is quiet, steady, and deeply intentional. To hold this kind of power, you must be willing to confront the parts of yourself that are still fragile, still hurt, still reactive. You must be able to ask yourself difficult questions. Why did that bother me? What am I afraid of? What am I trying to protect? What am I refusing to feel? These questions are not signs of weakness. They are signs of maturity. They are the questions that separate a person who fears their power from a person who can be trusted with it. There is a responsibility that comes with awakening. Once you know who you are and what you are capable of, you cannot pretend you don't know. You can no longer blame others for the choices you avoid. You can no longer use old stories to excuse new opportunities. You can no longer remain passive while claiming you want change. Power demands accountability, not to the world, but to yourself. And that is the most difficult kind of accountability because there is nowhere to hide. You are faced with the truth of your own potential, and that truth expects you to act. But this is also where life begins to shift. When you start using your strength for growth instead of ego, for clarity instead of control, for creation instead of competition, your world expands in ways you never imagined. You start to see that your energy is no longer wasted on battles that don't matter. You stop defending your worth because you finally embody it. You stop fighting for attention because you understand that attention is a poor substitute for inner alignment. You stop trying to win at life because you realize life is not something to win. It is something to inhabit fully. This responsibility is not a burden. It is a liberation. It frees you from the cycles that once imprisoned you. It frees you from the fear of other people's opinions. It frees you from the need to prove yourself. It frees you from the pull of impulses that once dictated your decisions. You begin to see that you are not here to overpower anyone. You are here to master yourself. And mastery is not about perfection. It is about awareness. It is about knowing when to act, when to rest, when to speak, when to stay silent, when to move forward, and when to let go. The more you step into this kind of responsibility, the more you realize that power is not something you hold. It is something you become. It lives in your posture, your decisions, your boundaries, your silence, your self-respect. It lives in the way you treat others, not because you fear consequences, but because you understand the weight of your presence. You recognize that every word you speak, every decision you make, every space you enter leaves an imprint. And a person who understands their power chooses to leave an imprint of clarity, not chaos, of truth, not pretense, of integrity, not ego. This is the essence of responsibility, using your power not to control the world, but to elevate the person you are becoming. There comes a point in your inner journey when you can no longer return to who you used to be. Not because you don't want to, but because the self you once were has grown. Too small, too tight, too outdated for the person you are becoming. Awakening is irreversible. Once you begin to see your truth, once you begin to recognize your patterns, once you begin to touch the deeper intelligence within you, the old life that once felt familiar starts to feel foreign. The habits that once comforted you now drain you. The relationships that once defined you no longer fit. The roles you once played begin to feel like costumes. And the version of yourself you used to present to the world becomes something you can't step back into without betraying something essential inside you. This shift is not dramatic at first. It begins quietly. You start noticing that your old coping mechanisms no longer numb you the way they used to. The distractions you once relied on lose their grip. The excuses you used to repeat begin to sound hollow in your own mind. You feel a subtle restlessness that pushes you towards something you can't yet name. And slowly, you realize that what you are feeling is the death of the former self, not a literal death, but the shedding of an identity that can no longer support your growth. Most people fear this moment because it feels like losing control. It feels like stepping into uncertainty. It feels like abandoning everything that once defined you. But what you are actually doing is stepping into a more authentic version of yourself. A self that is not built from fear, not shaped by approval, not limited by past mistakes, not bound to the expectations of others. You are stepping into the self that has been waiting behind every hesitation, every compromise, every quiet longing. And yet, becoming this new self requires courage, real courage. The kind that doesn't roar but whispers to you in the quiet hours. It's time. Time to stop shrinking to fit into places you've outgrown. Time to stop negotiating your worth. Time to stop silencing your intuition. Time to stop betraying yourself for comfort. Because every time you choose the old self out of fear, you delay the new self that is ready to emerge. The transition between who you were and who you are becoming is a sacred space. It is uncomfortable because it is honest. It asks you to let go of versions of yourself that were built for survival rather than expression. It asks you to release identities that were created to please others rather than honor your own truth. It asks you to walk away from dynamics that kept you small, even if those dynamics were once familiar, once safe, once deeply intertwined with your sense of belonging. You cannot become the new self while holding on to the old self with both hands. You must be willing to loosen your grip, to step into the unknown, to trust that the same inner force that awakened you will also guide you. Growth is not a straight path. You will resist. You will cling to the past. You will feel moments of doubt and moments of clarity, moments of strength and moments of collapse. But with every step, you will feel yourself aligning more deeply with the person you were always meant to be. Transformation requires that something in you dies. But what dies is not your essence. It is the version of you that was built on fear. It is the version that learned to settle, to silence itself, to tolerate what wounded it, to hide its brilliance, to trade authenticity for acceptance. And when this version begins to crumble, you may feel grief, confusion, even loneliness. But beneath that grief is freedom. Beneath that confusion is clarity. Beneath that loneliness is the first breath of a self that is finally allowed to live. And then something extraordinary happens. As the old self dissolves, the new self does not rush in all at once. It emerges slowly, breath by breath, choice by choice, moment by moment. You start noticing that you speak differently. You walk differently. You decide differently. You choose yourself in situations where you once abandoned yourself. You listen to your inner voice where you once ignored it. You enforce boundaries where you once apologized for existing. You rise to challenges that once terrified you. You begin to trust the person you are becoming, not because the path is clear, but because you finally understand that clarity comes from walking, not waiting. And this is the truth no one tells you. Once you awaken, the old life cannot contain you anymore. You're not going back. You are going forward, even when it scares you, even when it stretches you, even when it asks you to release everything that once felt like home. Because now you know that home was never a place or a person. It was the self you are finally becoming.